Okay, today we are trying something new. I am sitting down because I have been filming for a while. I had to do our review for a series and this chair moves and I'm just very much tempted to do like this all the time, but I will try and resist, okay? So hi, welcome. If you're new, my name is Eva. This is theinkedreader, my YouTube channel where I speak about books. And today I'm doing a video that I'm very excited to do, but I kept postponing it because I didn't want to get you wrong and then realized that I can't get it wrong. But I wanted to discuss with you guys all my favorite books of the last 10 years. So I have done a video a year back, I believe, where I was going through all the books that truly shaped my life. I've been a reader since I can remember. Reading is my #1 hobby and it truly shaped my life, and it also shaped my resilience toward life. I reached out for books in, some of the darkest moments of my life, and that really did help me out of it. And I also found inspirations from the stories and inspirations from the characters within those stories. So I've done that video where I was going through all the books that throughout my life I could remember that really made a difference, made an impact. But today what I wanted to do is focusing on the last decades of books. So going back from 2012-ish to 2022 and all the books I've loved in that decade. Today, in 2023, I am 31 years old, so I'm not going to include any book that I have read in 2023. First of all, because I do want to give books at least a year before I can decide if they're my ultimate favorite or not. I don't think that anything I've read this year had a fair chance to remain with me enough time for then, to me saying, yes, it is one of the best of all times for me. And also, I am technically already 31, so I'm not 30, and that would be cheating. So I'm gonna go through my favorite reads, my favorite books of all time in the last 10 years of my life. This is to say that some titles are not featured in here because I read them before I was 20. Game of Thrones is one of my favorite reads of all time, period, but I've read it before I was 20. Harry Potter, I read it before I was 20. Or I Kill by Giorgio Faletti, my favorite thriller ever, at least since I can remember, and it's not included in this video. The only two that I'm not sure I mentioned in that video of, my lives in books, which is gonna be linked down below by the way, is On the Road by Jack Kerouac. Jack Kerouac and On the Road is a book that I took with me when I went to Barcelona and Madrid, and he is my first Beat Generation read, and for that it's always gonna have a special place in my heart. But I've read it technically before I was 20, so it's not gonna be featured in here. And also the Hap and Leonard series by R. Lansdale. I might do a video on that separately. This is a noir story, and again it was my first exposure to noir literature and I fell in love with it. I fell in love with Lansdale writing style, with Hap and Leonard. I was heartbroken when they cancelled the series on Amazon because I adored it. I adore what it stands for, and I adored the two protagonists, Hap and Leonard. Everything of the Hap and Leonard series is perfection for me. Yes, but I've read it before I was 20. So I've read some of the later installments when I was already 20 or something, but as a whole series, the majority, the biggest chunk of it, I've read before 20. So this is why it's not technically included in this, I will have mentioned it. So without further ado, these are not in any particular order, apart from the top two. Like the top two, which I'm gonna mention at the end, are with Game of Thrones, my ultimate forever favorite books, and one of them is a very peculiar choice, but I'm gonna go through why I love them so much. I don't want to ramble too much though, so I'm gonna give you the synopsis. I'm gonna tell you just a couple of sentences on why I loved it that much. I divided them by genre just to make it easier for you guys. I don't know if that makes sense, so I can put timestamps in, but if they're not in order, like the genre are just random. Whether is in reach first, I'm gonna go for first. And of course, the top two are gonna be in one of these genres, but I'm not gonna tell you until the very end. So I would start potentially with classics. I've got 3 of them. The first one I'm gonna go with, I am honestly not sure when I read it. So I could potentially have read it before I was 20, but I am not sure, or maybe I was on the cusp of turning 20. So one of my favorite classics ever is Crime and Punishment by Fyodor Dostoevsky. This was my first Russian classic. I believe, and really left a mark, to a point there. I read this in Italian. I had an Italian copy, but when I moved here in England and I found this version of it, I had to purchase it, and this is something that I wanna reread fairly soon, just because I remember the main twist. I remember some of the things that happen in these. Again, sometimes I don't remember what I've read last month, so the fact that I can remember a book that I have read more than 10 years ago now, it is remarkable. Oh, actually, I'm already cheating. I've read this in 2011. So yeah, I was around 20 though, and I've never mentioned these, I believe. So it is warrant placing here. But yeah, I never mentioned these in that video, like, you know, the books that shaped my life. I'll take this occasion to give a shout out. I absolutely adored Crime and Punishment, where you follow this young man believing that he is, you know, above the law, and then he does commit a crime and he has to grapple with his own guilt, but also with, you know, a very persistent police officer that tries to find out the truth of his crime. And it was very lengthy, but at no point was boring, and I do remember vividly the inner dialogue of the protagonist and him dealing with, you know, the consequence of what he did. And I found just the concept fascinating. At the time, it was before I chose to study forensic psychology, but I cannot deny that this is one of the books that shaped that choice to a certain degree, although probably quite in my subconscious at that point. But yeah, Crime and Punishment, it is very famous for a reason, and I've not heard anybody hating Crime and Punishment. So then I have a very recent one, actually, Frankenstein. But now Dracula is another of my ultimate favorite books ever. It is, and before I turned 20, it was definitely my favorite classic. But Frankenstein, that I've read a couple of years ago, if not last year, absolutely took a spot in my ultimate favorite. We all know what Frankenstein is about. I had gone in quite ignorant, actually. I had always heard of it, but never in detail. So for me, it felt quite new, immersing myself in this story. And Frankenstein, you know, Dr. Frankenstein, he wants to recreate life, and he puts together this monster that, though when it's created, is disgusted by, and so he abandons the monster, and you follow the monster trying to get Frankenstein to love him, and eventually when he understands that it's not possible, he swears revenge. And for me, Frankenstein, he is all about the morality of it. It is all about the questions inside, and, you know, how you feel for the monster, and how then you understand his rage, and to what point do you justify the actions of the monster. Because there is a part of me, at least myself, I don't know if you had the same experience, where you kind of understand where the monster is coming from, and when you understand, there is a part of you that even justifies, but then you know that it's wrong justifying. So is that kind of questions it made me ask of myself and or my own morality that really stuck with me. I also like the symbolism in these. I think it's a book that I will reread, and every time I will reread it, I will get more out of it. And finally, for classics, I do have Rebecca by Daphne du Maurier. This is a gothic story, and in Rebecca you have an unnamed protagonist that marries this man who just lost his wife, Rebecca. He takes her to his mansion, Manderley, in England somewhere, and when the protagonist goes there, she finds out that Rebecca is very much alive in the minds of the people inhabiting Manderley, and she has to put together the pieces of what happened to Rebecca. And this was, first of all, my first experience of an unnamed protagonist, and I've seen it done after these a few times, and there is nothing as the first time, in my opinion. Like, something stuck with me, and every time someone is not named now, I'm just like, yeah, Rebecca did it before you. I've had this experience with the Flower Bride, like this one, the last tale of the Flower Bride, and this is a pet peeve of mine, and it's silly to be fair, but every time another author try to replicate a vibe like this and doesn't name their protagonist, I just see that as a copycat. Rebecca will always remain the standard for me. And I think what worked very well for me in Rebecca is how invested I was in the mystery and how the ending caught me by surprise. No, it's not the best thriller I've ever read. It's truly about Manderley, the atmosphere, and recognizing how much of a genius she was in creating this gothic novel. If you're into gothic novel, I really hope you give Rebecca a chance. Okay, let's go into literature fiction. I have just got a couple of things. So this is my Italian copy of My Brilliant Friend. I've read this in 2019, and I would include book number 1 and 2 in this list. Probably book number 2 even more. Maybe, no, it's the same. Not book number 3. I didn't love book number 3. It's translated from Italian, so I had the privilege, in this case, to read this in the original language, and I honestly went online multiple times throughout my reading experience of this, because I believe this was based on a true story, and it's not. This is the story of two friends. You follow them from their childhood up to their 60s, 70s, when one of them disappears. Each book is a chunk of their life. So in this is their childhood. I think in book number 2 was late teenagehood to very young 20s, and then book number 3 was in their 30ish, 40ish, and I guess in the last book, which I've yet to read, is gonna be like, you know, the last phase of their life. And you follow these two girls growing up poor and growing up in different families with different family dynamics, very different characters, but in the same environment. And the writing, guys, is story is so well written. Then I don't know how well it's translated because I've just read them in Italian, but in Italian I honestly couldn't believe that this wasn't true. To these days, I believe the author had to have some of these experiences herself, because if not, she is the best author I've ever read from. And her way of describing dynamics, places, and emotions was unique. Yes, I grew up in Italy. No, I didn't grow up in the area where she takes place in Naples. So I come from Milan. Visited once, but I'm not very familiar with. However, I don't know, there was something very Italian about all of this. Yes, probably that is also a contribution factor to why I love this so much, but so many people did that, you know, are not Italians. And this is a true statement on the power she has, this woman, in telling her stories. And I do want to check out the TV show, which I'm not sure if it's translated in English. I think it's an Italian TV show, but it's just the atmosphere that could seep through the pages. And I don't know if because I'm Italian, so something of the atmosphere reminded me of home, or if it's generally something that comes through the pages for everybody. So please, if you've read these and you're not Italian, or even if you are, like, let me know what you thought about these and if he hit you in the chest as it may. And then the other one, this is a very recent read, so this is a read for 2022. This is Betty by Tiffany McDaniel. I have to shout out The Summer That Melted Everything by her as well. That was the first book I tried by the author, and then proposed another by her to my book club. We picked it up, and the rest is history. Now, compared to these, this is purely fictional apparently. Betty is inspired by the true story of, I believe, the mother of the author. So the mother of the author, she is born half white, half Native American, if I remember correctly. And you follow the mother of the author, Betty, growing up under discrimination with a father that is abused and used by people. And you also follow her, and you also follow Betty, who has many siblings, navigating a very difficult and, I would say, mind-blowing, atrocious family situation. This is a book that had me shattered, like it shattered me. Certain scenes and the ability of the author of transmitting that scenes and really made them feel like you are living through them yourself is something that I have almost never experienced. I have experienced this to a certain degree with books like these, but Betty had a power behind it that is something that came even beyond the words that the author was using. So I fell in love with Betty. As long as you can see how many tabs I have, and the fact that parts of it, and I think the most salient parts are true, is something else. 100 degrees in this room. I've got goosebumps just thinking about this book. I've heard people describing, or comparing these as, A Little Life. I would argue as someone who didn't particularly love A Little Life, yes, it was shocking. Yes, I did overall quite enjoy it. Can you enjoy the book like that? But while I found that tragic for the sake of being tragic, these never felt that way. And these just felt raw. These just felt like someone writing about trauma and honoring their mother and their trauma in a way that is remarkable and is inspiring. And as someone who has made part of my life around, you know, helping people with trauma and knowing more about trauma and how it works, these maybe left a special mark because, again, of my background. I would say be careful with Betty. Look at the trigger warnings. If you're not okay with it at any point, put the book down, take some time. However, for me, Betty is like almost required reading, and it's not, it's just for me, but it really taught me a lot of things about resilience. And it was just generally also like an amazing reading experience just because of the way she writes her sentences and her stories. If you want something very hard-hitting but less heavy than Betty, I would say start with The Summer That Melted Everything. If you can put up with that and you want to step up like a couple of notches and really immerse yourself in trauma literature at the end of the day, then give a try to Betty. But yeah, amazing. Speaking of trauma, I'm gonna mention a book that I gave a friend of mine, so she's currently borrowing it from me, so I don't have it in my hands, but this is the only non-fiction I want to mention here. I will probably do like my favorite non-fiction at some point. I want to do definitely my favorite true crimes, because I thought about putting a couple of true crimes in this video, but then I decided not to for whatever reason. But The Body Keeps the Score. This is written by a psychiatrist. This is a book that when I started my previous job as a domestic violence advisor and working with youth that had been victims of violence, this is a book that my job, my workplace recommended when we did like the induction stage. At the point they said, you know, if you want to read this book, we really suggest it. And I never looked back. And this has become my Bible, and I am shoving this down people's throat left and right. Like my friend came after a year where she didn't come to my house, like, you need to go and read these. And she then wrote to me, just say, you know, these books were eye-opening. So for whoever has trauma and whoever has ever been told, oh, it's all in your head, or just move past it, this is your Bible, okay? So this is the author, who is also a scientist, telling you his life work, basically, where he specializes in trauma, and he tells you a lot about how trauma works biologically. So he looks at the brain that has experienced trauma and explains to you how, you know, the brain changes as a result of trauma. He speaks about his work with people who have, you know, veterans, war veterans, people who have suffered incredible abuse, who worked for him. I think he did go into EMDR at certain points. But again, if you're ever interested in trauma, how trauma works, how shapes who you are biologically speaking, you know, your brain changes because of it, and as a consequence then your feelings and behaviors, then look no further. I have to say it's a pretty dense read. It does explain things very well, so you don't have to have a scientific background in order to understand it, but you might need to reread a couple of things a couple of times. It is pretty dense, so, you know, take your time with it. For me, that I'm not religious, this is my Bible, and this is what I stand by every time, you know, I exit my house in the morning to go to work. Okay, let's talk about horror. Okay, with these ones, initially I had not put any of them in this list, apart from the top two. Like, not both my top two are horror, but one is horror, okay? Spoiler alert, one of my top two favorite books of all time are horror. However, when I was going through my shelves behind me and I saw these three titles, I immediately went, no, they need to be featured in that video. So let's start with Hunted by Chuck Palahniuk. I have done a review on my channel. This was one of my first videos, I believe, or one of the very few videos that is still up from when I was just filming with my phone and I was not that familiar with editing or anything of the sort. So if you want to look up a spoilery full review of Hunted, then I'll link it down below. But again, keep in mind, it's not, you know, the best of videos. However, it's quite it's probably one of the most viewed on my channel for whatever reason. And Hunted is a collection of short stories, technically speaking, but I would argue that actually is a novel, but made of sub-stories, because you follow these writer retreats, and each one of them at one point during this retreat tells a story. And so this, yes, is comprised of those short stories, but you have an overall plot. Now, this is a book that I want to reread because I remember a few stories, but not all of them, and the ending is a bit muddy, and that is why initially I did not put these on here. However, it was my first Palahniuk, I believe. I reached out for these after watching Fight Club, and then after this I read Fight Club, but I don't love Fight Club as a book as much as I loved Hunted. And I believe this book, going through, you know, the absurdity of reality TV show and a lot of denunciation of the human condition and what we are doing and social media and so on, although this is quite oldish. This was published in 2005. I think it was still so relevant. Not to say this was absolutely disgusting in certain points, but in the best way possible, and each of the stories made a lot of sense for the character they were being told from. And also, ultimately, I love his writing. Like, his writing style is truly something that is up my alley. A recent one, 12 Nights at Rotterhouse. Now, this has one of the best ending of any book ever. I loved the twist in this. This is a very quiet horror. This is the story of this writer that specializes in writing horror novels about haunted houses, and the way it works is that he will go to a specific place and then, you know, haunted place, and then write about that thing. Now he wants to write about Rotterhouse, so he decides to ask permission from the owner to spend 2 weeks there. Now Rotterhouse has no electricity, no water running, anything, but he says, I don't care, I'm just gonna go there, get the material for my book, and there is nothing as good as immersing myself in the house. So he goes there and invites his best friend with whom he had a fallout, so they both go and they try and stay there for 2 weeks, and the title tells you how many days they managed to stay. I can't say anything about this book. This is a very quiet horror. Like, for a lot of times nothing much happens. However, the author does an amazing job of creating the atmosphere. So when the few things that happen, I was shivering. I was scared to death. And then there is the ending. I understand it doesn't work for everyone. As someone who has often guessed twists, not always, of course, but a lot of the times nowadays I can guess the twist, so I lose the power. The twists, this one, didn't see coming. And when it happened, I was like, oh, you got me, man. I was so happy that this man got me and really surprised me. And the last one for now, before the top, we've got The Shining by Stephen King. Now, The Shining is the book that made me fall in love with Stephen King. Yes, then I've read Pet Sematary. Yes, then I've read It, and, you know, some of his other very famous titles, but nothing worked as good as The Shining. This is the story of little Danny. Danny moves with his parents to this hotel because his father is a caretaker, and he will spend the winter period when the hotel is closed with his dad and his mom in this hotel, just to take care of the hotel. And when they go there, very creepy stuff starts to happen in the hotel. And listen, I am so glad that this is the first book I ever experienced of Stephen King. Actually, to be full disclosure, I had read one by him before, but it was under a pseudonym and it was in Italian, and at the time I was very young, way before my 20s, and I had no idea it was the same author. So only after researching Stephen King and finding out that he has pen names, I discovered that I'd read another book by him. But the first time I picked up a book knowing it was a Stephen King book, it was The Shining. And some of the moments, some of the creepy stuff happening in this hotel are branded in my mind, like the hotel bathroom scene will stay forever in my mind. And I loved this book so much, but I hated the movie by Kubrick, okay? I know some people can love both, some people prefer the movie. I loved every single part of this. The only time I had a bit of like rolled my eyes is when something happens with like in the garden with the hedges. So that is the only thing I was like, really? That is a bit absurd, but the tension, the story, the plot, the goriness and the scary moments, the very creepy stuff happening, it was absolute perfection. The atmosphere, I was in the hotel at all times, and I fell in love with King and his story writing, his unique style. Sorry, my window just shut close with the wind. Yes, The Shining, Stephen King, my favorite King to this day, although I adore other books by him. But The Shining has a special place in my heart. Fantasy. Let's start with the most absurd and also like the book that made me laugh so much, together with another one got here that I can't stop thinking about it. Now, some of the very popular series, like, you know, the Stormlight Archives and so on, are not featured in this video. Not because I didn't love them. I might do like a second video on, you know, books that almost made into my favorite ones, but I didn't put them in here because, well, I'm very early on in the series. And for example, Game of Thrones is my favorite series ever because I've read everything that is out there and I've loved every single one of them, and the TV show on top of everything else, and also the prequel. So that is why it was a very solid series. But the Stormlight Archives, in my 20s, I have read just one of them. So this is why it's not in here. And what is in here though, it is The Lightning Struck Heart by TJ Klune. Now this is a series, it's a quartet, and I've read the first 3 books. None of the other 2 books would ever make into this list. I didn't love them as much as these, and I think this is in this list also because it was such a novelty, something like I'd never read before and never read since, apart from the sequels, that I kept just thinking about this book. This is the story of Sam. Sam is the apprentice of the wizard of the king. So in this kingdom, the king has a wizard, and there is this kind of structure to it. Now the prince will inherit the throne eventually, so he will need his own wizard. So Sam is now learning in order to then one day become the wizard of the official king once the prince ascends to the throne. And the problem we have is that the prince and Sam hate each other because Sam is in love with the captain of the guards, Ryan Foxhart, who is betrothed to the prince. So the dynamics in these are hilarious, but what is truly unique is the humor. You got Sam, who is hilarious and is very awkward, and he's definitely not ready to be the official wizard in the first book, and he has a giant and a unicorn without his horn as best friends, and they are horny and inappropriate, and they use a lot of sexual jokes that are absolutely out there. There is a poem, our song a bard sings at some point in this book that had me in tears. I was in the park, I had to go to the bathroom of the park and collect myself because I just couldn't stop laughing. And if people came to me and asked me why I was laughing, I would be ashamed of telling them because that song was so out there. I just know that after reading this book, I was going through a difficult time, but I had written down that poem on a piece of paper and kept it on my wallet. So every time I was feeling particularly down, I would pick up my wallet, read that poem out, and just generally smile. So this book provided me with a unique experience. It's a very bizarre story. It's not the best fantasy plot whatsoever. It's not here because of the plot or the fantastical elements. There's nothing of it. The sexual jokes can get on people's nerves, so this is not for everyone. And to be fair, at one point in book 2 and 3 became too much. I still adore the series as a whole. I still want to read, you know, all of them, but while book number 1 was a novelty, the other books in the series started to suffer from the fact that they didn't have a very good fantasy plot. But book number 1 was a blast. I included these in fantasy. It's magic realism. It could be in literature fiction as well, but well, I'm just going to include it in fantasy section. A Monster Call by Patrick Ness. So A Monster Call I've read in 2019, and this is illustrated, so you know, you got pictures like this. And this is the story of young Connor. And Connor, he is having a lot of nightmares since his mother started her treatment for cancer. And one night, though, he sees a nightmare he has never seen before. And there is this monster that will come and visit him for 7 nights. I believe it's 7 nights. And every night, the monster is gonna tell him something. And that something is the truth. And I think what this book did, It's, first of all, it completely devastated me. I think the main message I wanted to take out from this book is it's okay to sit with your own emotions. It is okay to have certain emotions and you don't have to necessarily fight them. It is okay. And that is such a powerful message. As you know, in the years after reading this book, I started working more with clients and people, and really this idea of mindfulness as being aware of your emotions and accepting them. And I can't think of any other book that tackled, for, you know, a younger audience, with a middle grade, I believe. Yes, I think it's a middle grade, tackled the idea of, you know, trauma, loss, grief as well, and as simply put as A Monster Call does. So yeah, Monster Call is another book that gives me shivers. And I watched the movie and adored it, and I would recommend to anybody who has ever experienced loss. Now the next one, it's actually a couple of them, but the other one I don't have in my hands. However, the other one might also be cheating, because I believe I read that one before my 20s, but I'm gonna mention it anyway. So I've got Going Postal and Reaper Man, both by the amazing Terry Pratchett. Now last year, I believe, or the year before, I completed the Discworld series. I've read all the 31 novels in the series, and I've done a video about that, so I'm gonna link it down below. And the Discworld series overall, it was one of the best experiences of my life, like one of the best comic relief fantasy series. But said that, it's a humoristic series full of humor, makes you laugh a lot. But Terry Pratchett also interwoven in the story, in the plot, a lot of very important messages, and he does it in a unique way. So when he passed away, the world lost one of the best writers. I genuinely adore Terry Pratchett and what he's done, and his books are books I will reread over and over again. Now Reaper Man is the first and my, you know, first favorite by him, and this is in the Death Quartet, or 5 books out, I don't remember. So the Discworld is done of, you know, is made of sub-series. I've read them chronologically though, mostly. And Reaper Man, death go on hiatus, so people cannot die anymore, and you follow this wizard that has really lived a long life, and he doesn't want to do it anymore, and he wants to die, and he can't die because death is nowhere inside. He's taken a holiday, and it's hilarious, man. It was one of my first Terry Pratchett books, and it's the book that made me think I need to read all of this series, and that is a vow that I kept. Even if it took me 10 years, it's a vow that I kept. And Going Postal is one of, I believe, I mean, in my opinion, is one of his last very good books in the series. After that, he starts having Alzheimer's, so his latest books are not the greatest, still good, but not the greatest, unfortunately. And it's the last one I truly adored, start to finish. You follow this criminal who is saved from hanging and given the task to put together again the postal office. Young Morthok basically is told by the mayor, either you do this or you can go back and hang. And you might ask yourself, how come, like, you know, a book about a post office can be so great? It can be because Terry Pratchett makes it so. So once you read Going Postal or Reaper Man, I bet you want to read more by Terry Pratchett. Yes, you don't have to read all the Discworld series by any means. There are sub-series that are stronger overall, but Going Postal made me think about the least possibly interesting plot or environment for a plot, a post office, and made it into one of the most wonderful books I've ever read. And the most recent entry, I believe, is Empire of the Vampire by J. Christoph. I have read his Nevernight series and really liked it overall, but nothing struck a chord as Empire of the Vampire. I adore vampires. Creatures they are my favorite fantasy creatures either. Fae, not bad. Werewolf, cool. Vampires, I love. And I reviewed this book when I read this last year and said, listen, like Empire of the Vampire felt like me and Mr. Christoph met randomly at a cafe, drank a cup of tea together, and he asked me, Eva, what is your perfect book? And I told him, and he went home and wrote this. And to this day, this is still how I feel about this book. So Empire of the Vampire, it's the start of a series, and you follow, my main protagonist called Gabriel, yes, Gabriel de Leon. And you follow him now being captured and retelling the story of how he became, you know, the most famous vampire hunter ever. And I want to keep the plot fairly vague because I generally don't know what would be considered spoilers. But can you tell that I absolutely love this writing? Can you tell? I don't tab usually so much my books. Like, the books are a lot tabbed. It means I really adore that. This book has full pictures in it. And I am on the lookout for special editions. I've seen the Lumicrate one that they did when this came out, and I am still biting my fingers to this day, a year after, to not be subscribed to Illumicrate because of that. So this is perfection. This is the kind of fantasy that I adore. It has an amazing, compelling plot, and although you follow the past and the present, but in the past you follow different parts of the past, the way it was paced, structured, it was perfection. I was never confused. I was never bored. I had the same experience with Game of Thrones, for example. Now Game of Thrones is still top tier, but it's the same idea of reading a very lengthy fantasy and adoring every single sentence, every single word, every single chapter of that story. I adored our main protagonist. I liked how everything was morally grey in this, and just the action and his writing. Thriller, the last genre before we go into the top tip of the last 10 years. So we got Night Film. This initially I believe they wanted to put it as an honorable mention. Thank you, kid, for shouting outside my window in the streets. Night Film almost didn't make it into this list because I had heard some reviews making some good points against this book, and I got a bit influenced by it. But ultimately, every time I look at Night Film, I adore Night Film, and so I thought, who cares? Night Film, you follow this journalist investigating the death of a beautiful, I don't know if she was an actress or something, so Ashley Cordova, she's dead. People think it's a suicide, but this journalist believes that something sinister has actually been going on, and so he decides to go on this path to put together the pieces and find out what indeed happened to Ashley. And one of the things that made this book absolutely remarkable for me, yes, the fact that it's interactive, so I think you could download an app and add some of the things like on the app, some audio or stuff like that, which was a novelty. But what really caught my attention and kept my attention and made me want to read these and ultimately feature these in this video is there are like a very action-packed 200 pages toward the end that I thought it was perfection. At the time when I read these, I had recently finished a university course on cinematography, and I had been forced to watch David Lynch stuff. And if you know Lynch, Mulholland Drive, Inland Empire, stuff like that. So I was forced to watch stuff like that, and I was somehow glad I was forced because I did end up enjoying a lot of those things I was forced to watch, like Kubrick stuff and things like this. And this book, it was a perfect subsequent read to me watching those kind of movies. And if you watched or you know the style of movies I talk about, you know why I appreciated this book so much, because it truly brought me back to those kind of bizarre scenes with like bizarre horror elements that are so sinister and creepy without actually having a monster in it, if it makes sense. And so the tension that these 200 pages kept ongoing, these kind of place that the protagonist finds himself in, truly I could picture it done by David Lynch so well. And this is a book that I think David Lynch would adapt so well. And so it was a lot of reminiscence of a lot of sentiments I had watched and lived through, just translated in a book format that really struck a chord with me. And I did enjoy the ending as well, which I know that a lot of people didn't, but I didn't mind the ending. Sadie. Sadie is a story told in a podcast format. A bit you follow Sadie in the past, and then you follow this podcast because Sadie has disappeared, and so you follow the future a bit. So Sadie is someone who's on a path of revenge after her sister was abused and killed. And then you follow the podcast trying to put together the pieces of what happened to Sadie, who has now disappeared as well. And the way Courtney Summers expressed the idea of trauma, loss, grief and revenge was unique. It's a very short book and it packed a punch. No, I didn't listen to the audiobook. I know that has been praised a lot for the podcast element to it, but for me this, as you can see the tabs, worked so well because of the writing and because of Sadie, and it's that kind of protagonist that I would like to think myself of being if I was ever in an atrocious situation like this. Now, thank any god you might believe in that this is not something that could ever happen to me. I don't have a little sister, so you know, it's a very far-fetched idea of saying if this was ever to happen to me I would be like Sadie, but that's what it felt too. And I don't know, maybe it was just how skillful the author was or how her writing just particularly called to me. And also the ending of this is an ending that I would have hated in any other book, and I've hated that kind of ending in multiple books before. Never worked for me apart from these, and I don't know if it's because at that point I was so in love with everything else that I didn't mind, or because I found the ending particularly apt to the story. And I'm gonna do a brief shout out to The Female of the Species, which had amazing writing, very similar concept and story to a certain degree. So again, it didn't make it into this video because I think I read this year by the way, and some of the things of this plot felt a bit more far-fetched than Sadie, although technically speaking they're both, you know, teens going for revenge and it's not realistic, but some of the things in here felt slightly more far-fetched than it did in Sadie. But yeah, just shouting out these as well. I'm thinking of ending things. Oh man, like this book was a trip. There is no synopsis, so I don't know what to say not to spoil anything. I'm just gonna say that you follow this man who decides one day to take his girlfriend, fairly new girlfriend, to meet his parents. So they go on this road trip and then it starts snowing and they start talking and the story just becomes, it's nuts. Like this is, as I said, for example, with 12 Nights at Rotter House, this is a book that caught me by surprise. I knew something was about to come, like I knew at certain points something would happen, but I could never have guessed. And when I finished reading this book, I wanted to just literally go to everyone I met in the street and just say, read this and tell me what you thought about this. It was done so well. It was done just so bloody well. I did watch the movie and I didn't love the movie so much because I thought the movie made everything that was happening very clear. So I would have guessed what was all behind if I'd watched the movie only. But in the book, didn't see it coming. I had no idea. I was having so many questions in my mind, and the way it's crafted, it's perfection. Like I don't have one single ounce of complaint about I'm thinking of ending things. I'm getting excited just speaking about these books, and I wish I could go back in time and reread these books. That's how much I love them. Last one for thrillers and very recent addition must be Intensity. Now, Intensity is it's a twisted story, and so please don't judge me because it's where I'm not violent. I am a very peaceful person. Intensity was the best read of 2022, and I finished that decade with a bang. And Intensity, I don't know if I've got the right words to describe this book. So Intensity is the story of these two friends. Specifically, you follow China, and China has been invited by a university friend to spend a holiday at her house in California because China didn't have family. Whether it's the case, I don't remember exactly. So she goes and, to meet the family of her friend and just spend their holidays there. They go there the first night, they have dinner, they go to bed, and in the middle of the night, China, she is awoken by some very creepy noises. And so she goes investigate, and she finds out that the whole family has been killed and her friend has been taken prisoner, and the killer is still in the house. Now, Intensity could also be called Adrenaline. This book was, yes, far-fetched. I'm not gonna argue on all the way you can unpack this plot as being absolutely absurd. China has so many occasions to go and ask for help and never does. Yes, she has her own motivations, but definitely not truth to life. Nothing in this book is truth to life, okay? The reason why it's my favorite or among my favorite of all times is because of the way the plot is created, the way the writing was way more deep than I believed a story like this could ever had. So I was expecting the writing to just be okay, you know, and just the plot take over. The writing doesn't let the plot take over completely. He is a very skillful writer, and he can say pretty intense, deep things coming from the mouth of a sociopath. And there are some of the quotes of these utterly terrifying men that he creates that really struck a chord within me. It's like, wow, that is intense, that is deep. And that was terrifying, the fact that I was quoting, or I am to this day sometimes quoting, the most horrific guy I've ever read about. This is also something that has to go towards a point for intensity. He creates a villain that is creepier than any other villains that I've ever read. He is the most intense guy. Like, he is the guy that I would, to this day, when I go to bed sometimes and think about this book, is the last villain I would ever want to be around. And I've read Game of Thrones. I've read very intense, very masterfully crafted fantasy stories or thrillers, you know, with very bad guys in it. This is the guy I would want to meet the least. This is the book I would never want to be in. Like, I usually, you know, if you ask me, you know, I would love to have a chance to enter, like, and live a life of so many books. Even when, you know, some bad things happen or like life is hard, I would still love to be part of that world or that book most of the times. This one, no. Nope. If they tell me, okay, Eva, you can live through intensity, and then when you get out of intensity, you can live throughout all the other books you want to, I would say no, because I wouldn't want to be in intensity at all. People like these. Horrifying. To be fair, although the killer in here was, again, as a bit far-fetched as all the other elements of this story, I think he does a good job of researching a true psychopath. He clearly knows stuff about serial killers, and unfortunately he was far-fetched, but not that much, and so that's why probably I found it so creepy and so effective. But this book is adrenaline. Like, you open it up and you just can't close it down. I read this in one day, and it's a horrific experience to have because it's terrifying. I just couldn't stop reading. It is pure adrenaline. If I tell you, you know, what adrenaline feels like, and you don't have the words to express yourself, make them read Intensity. They will know what adrenaline is. And so we have made it to the last two books, and my top two of the last 10 years, without any doubts. I will start with the one you probably already know because I've mentioned this a bunch of times. It's The Shadow of the Wind. Speaking about tabs, yes, I have read the whole quartet. No, I didn't love any of the other books in the quartet as much as I loved The Shadow of the Wind. But yes, I have absolutely adored his writing in everything I've read by him. I have read now other stuff by him outside this quartet. I don't know, reading these, knowing that the author had passed away, made me, I don't know, have like a very bittersweet taste in my mouth at all times. I would consider this like a historical fiction / literature fiction with, though, a very prevalent thriller aspect to it. And you follow Daniel in 1945, I believe, is taken by his father to the cemetery of the forgotten books. So this is a secret library where books that have gone out of print, have been prohibited, no other copies exist, are kept. There is only one copy left of these books, and they all end up in this secret library. And Daniel's father tells his son, go and pick up a book, choose a book, and you're gonna have the task of, you know, caring for the book for your life. And Daniel chooses a book, and this book is written by an author that ended up disappearing, and, you know, his end is a mystery. So Daniel becomes obsessed with his author and what happened to him, and so he goes on this path of finding answers throughout Barcelona and put together the story of the author. And The Shadow of the Wind has some of the most beautiful writing I've ever read. It is a book that at the point when I read these, I think around 5 years ago, I didn't have any book recently that had made me want to forget life until I was done with the book, and this book did it. It had the perfect match of writing, outstanding writing, and the atmosphere of this Barcelona in the 40s, 50s, 1950s, and the element of thriller. You don't know what happened and you want to put together this story that captivated me, kept me on the edge of my seat, and I just couldn't let go of this book, and I became obsessed with this book. To these days, I am obsessed with these books. Like the two ones that are here, I am obsessed with them for very different reasons. Just sometimes I just take them out and just look at them, and I'm just so grateful because I know that in 10 years, only two things made me feel like as these two books did. They are a statement for me of the power of words and how powerful a book can be. This is a book about books, but it's a book about so much else. It's a book about being human. It's a book about love and loss and grief and revenge and, you know, the mystery of life. Also, this is a book that I went in knowing that it was super popular, expecting to be just, okay, yeah, good one. I adored it. And after that, I trust the hype a bit more. We've made it to book number 1. I've been filming for 3 hours, I believe. I had to catch up with another video as well. So my voice is gone, light is gone, but I have to speak about this book. So the other book, together with The Shadow of Wind, that provided me with one of the most intense reading experiences of my whole life. It's a book that I would not suggest to everybody. While The Shadow of Wind, I would pick it up. It's for everyone. This one, no. Just look at trigger warnings. I don't even know who I would suggest it to. I would say if you're really into horror, yes. If you are sensible stomach, whether it's the case, definitely don't go into this. This is not me recommending this. This is generally being honest and just say this is a book that changed my life. After this, I started reading horror. And after this, I started loving horror and discovering how much horror has to offer. And I don't do horror movies, I don't care for that, so this truly was a revolution. And this book is The Devil of Nanking by Mo Haider. This book took me by storm. It was a book that after I finished, I had to go and get a hug because I was shaking and crying, and it was something else. I've read other stuff by Mo Haider and I really like her writing, always. I really enjoy her writing and how savage, and it is the kind of thriller, the kind of crime novels she writes that really work well for me, but nothing like The Devil of Nanking. So The Devil of Nanking takes place in Tokyo in 1990s, and you follow Grace, I believe. Yeah, no, Gray. Gray, she is obsessed by retrieving a piece of footage of the massacre of Nanking from 1937, I believe. Yes, 1937. And she knows that there is this footage allegedly somewhere in Tokyo, and so she go on a path of finding a job in a club as hostess, befriending mob people in order to retrieve this piece of footage. Now, the massacre of Nanking, before reading this book, I had no idea what it was. And then I did look it up, I did find out what it was, and I was shocked that this is not told or taught in schools, or like not in Europe at least. Definitely not in Italy where I studied, and we had no idea of some of, you know, the most atrocious things that happen in history. And I'm not gonna go in any details on what it is. You can look it up for yourself. But I don't know what to say about this book. This book was violently intense. It had like a threat of violence, and at all points. It's a horror that I never experienced before. It's that kind of horror that it's not about the monster in the closet. It's a kind of horror that feels more real because it's about people and the horrible things that people can do to other people. And it's about dehumanization, and it has some of the most atrocious things and atrocious scenes I've ever read about. I have done a challenge of reading the 10 most disturbing books ever written. I'll link it down below the wrap up. So I went through all of those 10 books and nothing disturbed me. nearly as much as The Devil of Nanking disturbed me. So to these days, The Devil of Nanking is the book that disturbed me the most, and I have gone and read horror, very intense horror, cannibalistic horror, whatever you want to think. I went and read it, and nothing left me with the same deep desperation for humanity that The Devil of Nanking left me with. I don't know if it was just a me thing. Maybe it was the right book at the right time that did a trick on me, whether it's the case. It has a very compelling plot. If you like horror, this is very solid for how much atrocious you can, objectively realize that it is. What's happening at all times, it has a very good, want to know what's next. You want to find the answer to the same question that Gray has. But ultimately, what made me put this book on here and decide that, this is one of my favorite books, because it provided me with something that no other book has ever done before. So I would be curious to check in 10 years time, if I am here on this earth and if I have my YouTube channel going, whether is the case, to see if in 10 years I found something else that struck a chord or truly made me, was truly as scandalous, was truly as devastating as The Devil of Nanking was for me. That's it, guys. I'm honestly curious to know, what is your favorite read of the last 10 years? What are your top 2-3 reads? Because I'm always looking for recommendations. So, hopefully I will love as much some of those books as you did. Please don't get offended if I don't. I've got very weird tastes in books, because I can go from The Shadow of the Wind to The Devil of Nanking. If you put them together, these are a bit odd. I would love for you to subscribe if you're new. Thank you guys for sticking around for a long video, but I thought it was a fundamental video to have on my channel, considering that this is a booktube channel. And yeah, I'll see you next time. Take care of yourself. Ciao!